প্রিয় দর্শক, আপনাদের সবাইকে স্বাগত অর্থ সংলাপে। আপনাদের প্রিয় অনুষ্ঠান বাংলাদেশের অর্থনীতির এগিয়ে যাওয়া, সংকট, সম্ভাবনা সবকিছু নিয়ে আমরা আলোচনা করি এই অনুষ্ঠানে। আপনারা জানেন যে প্রতিদিন কোনো সব এপিসোডে আমরা একটা বিষয়ের গভীরে যেতে চাই। আজ আমাদের সাথে আছে দুজন বিশিষ্ট জন, তারা এক পরিবেশবিদ এবং অর্থনীতিবিদ। সারা কোলেনব্রান্ডার, তিনি আছেন হিউম্যান রিসোর্স সেটেলমেন্ট গ্রুপ, ইন্টারন্যাশনাল ইনস্টিটিউট অফ এনভায়রনমেন্ট অ্যান্ড ডেভেলপমেন্টে কাজ করেন। আছেন নর্টন, তিনি ডিরেক্টর অফ ইন্টারন্যাশনাল ইনস্টিটিউট অফ এনভায়রনমেন্ট অ্যান্ড ডেভেলপমেন্ট। দুজনেই ক্লাইমেট চেঞ্জ, পরিবেশের উপর প্রভাব, ক্লাইমেট চেঞ্জের বিভিন্ন এবং অর্থনৈতিক দিক নিয়ে গবেষণা করেন। সেসব বিষয়ে বাংলাদেশ পার্সপেক্টিভ আলোচনা করবো আমরা তার সাথে। আমরা যাচ্ছি তাদের সাথে। নর্টন, I think I have gone through the CV of you. You have studied much about the sociological impact on the climate change.
Yeah.
How really they are impacting on the lives, communities in Bangladesh, and what is the difference, the impact in Bangladesh and the other climate impacted regions?
Well, there's various channels through which climate change can impact, particularly on poor people. One of the features of climate change is it tends to hit poor communities and poor countries harder than richer communities and richer countries. So it's a deeply unfair phenomenon because these are the people who have not put the emissions in the atmosphere, which is causing climate change. But just to take one example from drylands in most of the world, whether in Africa or in Asia, women, for example, are responsible for fetching water, and typically climate change makes water scarcer, which increases their labour burdens. So that's just one example, but there are many other ways. If I had to pick one thing that's striking about Bangladesh, this is my first time in Bangladesh, it's a great pleasure to be here, but it is the issue of sea level rise, which is so very immediate.
We have panicked much about the media reports that sea level is rising so fast. How is really happening? Is it so panicky? Or
well, sea level rise is outstripping what people thought it would be a few years ago, which is why there's a lot of concern. If you take the big kind of scientific report on climate change by the IPCC, the fifth report, that was 2014, and that said unchecked climate change will raise sea levels by 1 metre by 2100. In Bangladesh, that displaces 20 million people. Globally, that displaces 300 million people. Now, I think most scientists would go for a figure of 2075. So in a very short space of time, in just over 2 years, we've moved that forward by 25 years, which is because of data emerging from particularly the Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheets, which are melting faster. The scientific data keeps making that look like it's faster than people thought it was even 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah. Sarah, you are an economist, I think, I found. I think that in economic angle, in the global perspective, how economics is changing, on economics is responding to the climate change in the last 1 decade, if you compare with the 3 decades back or 5 decades back.
What are the economic costs of climate change?
Yeah.
Well, I think that unfortunately we're already starting to see those economic costs. So just in the last few years, I know a lot of us will have noticed the unusual strength of some of the typhoons, such as Typhoon Haiyan, which recently hit the Philippines, or the cyclone, which recently hit New York. The sheer human cost of these has been immense, but of course there's also an immense economic cost from all the damage to infrastructure. So in the last 10 years we've seen that rise very dramatically. In the future it's predicted to increase even further, but to up to 5, 10, 20% of global GDP from these catastrophic events.
What percentage?
It depends on which economist you're talking to. It's a long-standing debate and there's lots of not particularly exciting papers written about it, but some economists estimate that about 10% of global GDP
10%
every
of
year,
global GDP,
really high numbers, will be lost as a result of lost growth and these catastrophic events.
Oh, not. I think that you are attending a very exciting seminar on communities adoption on climate change. How you find the awareness in communities about the climate change impact?
Well, I think awareness at the conference is very high. These are kind of organised community members, some of them are NGOs and others who work with communities, and they're very, very well informed. You can go to some parts of the world and find that people are aware that the climate is changing, but not so aware of what is causing it, if you like.
Oh, they feel the natural disaster is the acts of God,
Yes.
or many things that people usually feel in the developing countries like
Yes.
Bangladesh. But you know, the how government can raise the effective awareness among
Yeah.
communities to
Yeah.
prevent and to save from the climate change impact. How?
Government has a very important role. Some of the things that have shown good results include working with meteorological services to help people to understand the ways in which the climate is changing, but also to help farmers and others predict movements in the weather in a year-on-year basis. So yeah, there's many things I think that government can do to raise awareness, and also just basic outreach, radio, television, newspapers. There's a lot of it in Bangladesh actually. I believe that Bangladesh is an unusually aware country on climate change.
Sir, I went through that you studied about the climate and energy policy. It's one of the expertise area for you. I know the energy consumption is increasing in Bangladesh. We're increasing our electricity production and burning fuels and many things. How should we, you think there should be the ideal energy policy for a country like Bangladesh?
It's always a very tricky question for somewhere like Bangladesh, because no one believes, who has any sense of climate justice, that Bangladesh should have to sacrifice any human or economic development. The aim is to make sure that that development is as low carbon and as climate resilient as possible. So in an ideal situation, Bangladesh would be able to have a combination of some stable baseload electricity supply. So that might be hydropower, for example. Increasingly tidal and ocean power look promising, and I hear Bangladesh has a long coastline that could take advantage of that. Of course, those are still quite pioneering technologies. So solar and wind are becoming much more economically attractive. The costs have halved, quartered, divided by multiples of 10 in the last couple of decades. But it still remains problematic for Bangladesh to have to pay more for its energy than the rich world previously did, because it could use cheap coal and natural gas. And that's where there's a real role for climate finance and for developed countries to support the development of low carbon energy in Bangladesh.
It's a very good time and good course. Really, real days of emission has not been started in Bangladesh. It is coming. I'll come to you because I have to hear much more from you. Norton, as she said about the economics of climate change, you know, as a sociologist, how can I say that you like it Bangladesh, you feel purchasing capacity of the people increasing, they're getting air conditioners, they're getting refrigerators, more emissions are there. Is the social upliftment is hitting hard the economy, or the making threats to economy? How the society will balance it? Society will remain responsible to environment and continue to his responsible consumption. How should be balanced?
Well, the first thing to be aware of is that Bangladesh's per capita emissions are still very low. I think 0.4 metric tons, which is less than 1/40th of the average in the United States. So as Sarah was saying, there has to be space for development. This is a country where individuals do not put much climate pollution in the air. It's important to be aware of that. In terms of how Bangladesh moves forward to develop in greener ways, to develop in ways whereby they can retain, if you like, that low per capita emission, I think, the things Sarah said are very relevant, that you need to look to solar power, which is very suitable in the environment here, but also policies that help in other ways. If you take the urban space, for example, I should really hand this to Sarah because she's more of an expert on that, but well-designed cities can also greatly reduce emissions. So don't only focus on the energy sector, there's also transport and the urban sector as well.
Sarah, how you feel this combination? The growing economic power of society is making threat to emission. Growing economic power of society is inviting more temperature. How is the balance of ideal position of this situation?
I think something that people often don't realise is that many of the things we should be doing to act on climate change are also things we should be doing if we want an inclusive society or a productive society.
Yeah.
So no one is ever going to invest in public transport because it's low carbon, or no one's going to invest in public transport because they want to make a profit. You invest in public transport because you want people to be able to commute to their jobs easily, and because you want to improve air quality, and because, particularly in Dhaka's case, you want to reduce congestion and road accidents. But these kind of measures have huge social benefits and huge climate benefits and huge economic benefits for the city as a unit. So you have this intersection between these different goals when you do act on climate change, or when you use it as a lever to attract international finance.
And but the finance is a very interesting issue. We sometimes go through the headlines on the international finance. There is a clumsy situation. The Bangladesh perceived it would get much finance to fight with the climate change impacts, but it is not getting now. Do you think the developed countries or the rich countries are very much responsible to arrange finance for mitigating climate change impact?
I think over the next 10 to 15 years, it's going to become much easier to get the money for low carbon investments, partially because a lot of them are very profitable.
Where? From where? From it to
From the private sector.
Yeah.
From the World Bank, from those multilateral agencies. So there's a lot of momentum for investing in energy efficiency, in renewable energy, because you can capture the benefits from that. You can capture energy savings over time, you can sell clean energy to the consumer and make a profit. I think the question about adaptation is going to be much harder. It's very hard to attract international private finance to improve the resilience of households and communities.
Why it is harder for adaptation? Why it is harder for adaptation by the communities?
Because the cost savings from adaptation come from avoiding the costs of negative impacts.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time those are not experienced by the international community. They're experienced by the low-income groups, by marginalised groups who live on floodplains, who live on steep slopes. And so it's very hard to get an economic return from it. There's a huge human return and a huge social return, but from the pure economic case, it doesn't seem to be compelling yet, sadly.
Norton, how government should increase its capacity to design the very effective design of adaptation? How it can help the communities?
I think it's very important to learn from the communities. In fact, I think a lot of the most effective adaptation takes place at the community level. But you also need strong links between local government and the community level. And we need to, talking about finance, I think one of the urgent needs is to find ways of delivering climate finance effectively to the local level, because adaptation is a local activity. It takes place mostly in the local space at the community level. Not entirely, you have some infrastructure as well, but mostly. So it's important to be able to deliver funds in such a way that the local government and the community can work together on issues like improving drainage, for example. This is really important. It's something we've looked at quite a lot at the conference. And it's something that the funds are not good at yet.
Yeah, sometimes it's a social questions, Sometimes it happens that there is a adaptation capacity and the indigenous capacity for adaptation is different than what is discussed in seminars, in the international conferences. How we can connect the effective designs, indigenous capacity and the real productive capacity?
Yeah, it's not easy. There is also, I think, indigenous knowledge and indigenous learning is based on historic experience.
Yeah.
A lot of the things you are seeing now, there is no historic experience. There's no historic experience of people losing their land because of rapid sea level rise. There's no historic experience of cyclones coming and destroying the productive capacity of large amounts of ecosystems like the Sundarbans. So you need to bring together the way people respond, how they understand their own environment. That's a very important part of it. But you do need to bring that together with policy from the global community and the national community as well.
Okay. Colenbrander, I should come to you, one of the four, taking some experience. As you were 3 or 4 days here in Dhaka, I think you have seen a lot of part of in the city. How you have found the capacities of our city to fight or to be much aware about the climate change and everything? Do you find is the enough capacity you have, or enough awareness we have?
I think there are two questions there. I'm really impressed by the levels of awareness in Dhaka in particular of climate change, much more than most places I've been. And there's a real willingness to experiment with new financing mechanisms, with new policies to try and build people's adaptive capacity. I think Bangladesh is a world leader on adaptation. I think that even though the government and the private and civil society sectors are very active on this, I think due to the fact that Bangladesh is a lower middle income country, it doesn't have that high an adaptive capacity. And that is compounded by the fact that it is a particularly vulnerable country because it is so low-lying and so susceptible to sea surge, to tropical storms, to sea level rise. But I see at the moment that a lot of the things that are being done in Dhaka are going to hugely increase the citizens' capacity to cope. So it seems like at the moment we've passed roadworks where new drainage is being built, new sanitation systems are being built, informal settlements are being upgraded to make them stronger in the face of extreme weather. And all of those things really reach the most vulnerable communities and help them to cope with these new shocks and stresses, and in that way to become much more economically productive and politically involved members of society.
Norton, Shishore is a question again. How, I think it's a very short time to observe these. How you have found the social capacity of Bangladesh?
Well, I've only really seen that in the conference itself, interacting with many of the Bangladeshis who are there. But I just agree with Sarah that Bangladesh is a world leader on adaptation, and I think as other countries face similar problems, there'll be a lot of experience from Bangladesh that can be deployed in other countries, including developed countries.
One thing, I think it should be the last question to you. I think your first time in Bangladesh, but you are related with Bangladesh with knowledge of climate change and others for many years, I think. Based on that knowledge and the now physical presence, what is your suggestion to government and the stakeholders in Bangladesh to plan the effective policies for climate change mitigation initiatives?
I think Bangladesh could play a great role for the world in leading this thing that we need to do about taking much more climate finance down from the global level effectively all the way to the community level. I think Bangladesh has the institutions, the governmental and the local institutions, to do that. And if it can pilot that, then I think that would be a great favour to the world. It's something that needs to happen, as Sarah was mentioning. At the moment, public climate finance, there is not enough flowing for adaptation. One of the things we need to do is to demonstrate that that money gets used well when it's put in the hands of communities with the right support.
Sarah, economy again, how you see, what should the policies of the government, how it can design the effective policy to mitigate the economic impact of climate change?
It's good development. Development that meets people's basic needs and empowers them to be healthy and productive members of society will help them cope better with climate change. In the longer term, I think Bangladesh and lots of countries are going to have to make some hard decisions. There will be some coastal infrastructure that might have to be relocated or abandoned. There might be some communities living on floodplains who might have to relocate. But if you have an inclusive governance system where people who are vulnerable have a clear voice and have a clear influence over decision making,
and should include their voice. Sometimes government does, government thinks, government discuss, but the people really victim, they remain distant. They don't have voice.
If they have
how
a voice,
can include their voice effectively?
There are emerging ways, and again Bangladesh is a leader in this, but there's more and more platforms where these two groups come together to jointly plan infrastructure. So when informal settlements and mobilize together to negotiate with municipal governments, to negotiate with the national government, and to together find ways that empower both to act more effectively on climate change.
Oh, how should mitigate the government and the other stakeholder should mitigate their distance between them and the real communities who are really victim of climate change? How to mitigate and inclusive, make things inclusive? How can they do this?
It's just a question, I think, of seeking to include people, seeking to treat them as, if you like, participants, active participants in their own development and in climate adaptation. I think that's the key thing in terms of the mindset. And I kind of agree with Sarah that I think Bangladesh is pretty good. But I think there are many countries where we need to work harder to recognise the capabilities that people have to do their own development and to do their own adaptation.
My question to Sarah is how can government raise funds from internal sources to fight the economic impact of climate change? Can you suggest some intelligent ways, innovative ways, then government work with?
There are quite a lot of innovative ways emerging. So one way that is proving very effective in strengthening people's adaptive capacity as well is to work with existing savings groups. So in lots of countries around the world, particularly informal settlements, who are, as I mentioned before, some of the most vulnerable people in the world, often work together to form typically women-led saving groups.
Women-led saving groups.
Yeah.
Bangladesh is champion there.
Yeah. Bangladesh is a world leader on microfinance, and this is not dissimilar.
Yeah.
And because people are putting in very small amounts of their own money, it brings them together to act collectively around things that they will help them respond to climate impacts like drains, like sanitation systems. But when these organisations and these savings groups partner with government, it creates a whole new source of investment in that households are now investing in the infrastructure that will provide them with adaptive capacity. But of course there's a whole lot of emerging mechanisms such as green bonds, energy efficiency bonds, and that sort of thing to unlock private sector finance as well. And as Bangladesh's economy grows so fast, I think that's going to be an increasingly important
Usually
option.
in developing countries, private sector does not voluntarily finance in these sort of projects. How government can oblige them?
Government plays a major role in two ways. One is that it can reduce the risks associated with a project. So it can do that by providing guarantees, for example, that if a project fails, the government will help support the company to get through that. Or it can do it by increasing the returns. So that's been a very good way to improve the economics of lots of renewable energy technologies by subsidising the sales of electricity from solar panels, for example, until they became economically competitive.
Norton, I have not found much awareness among the politicians. Even they don't have included climate issues in their political agendas, election agendas. Do you think it's different than other countries?
No, not enormously. I think the political awareness of climate change.
Where you have
in
found
many
ideal
countries-
things in the world? Do you have found anything ideal across the
Well,
world?
I guess-
Politicians are much aware.
Yeah, there's one political leader who I can pick out who made a difference on climate change, which was Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Who, Ethiopia became a real climate leader at the political level. Also, it's a country that's endowed with very good renewable energy resources, but it's really gone for them in terms. So, every country submitted to the Paris Conference on Climate Change its own plan, and Ethiopia's was ranked one of the very best on mitigation because they're putting so much effort into that. So it's a combination there, I guess, of political leadership and, if you like, real action in the economy. It's not that common, but certainly there are examples of politicians who have given leadership.
But really the political awareness works well and it brings the best result. That's why it's a very critical question. Sarah, thank you. Norton, thank you, because in a very short of time you have dealt a lot of issues about the awareness. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
প্রিয় দর্শক, আমাদের সাথে ছিলেন সারা কোলেনব্রান্ডার, রিসার্চার। তিনি ইন্টারন্যাশনাল ইনস্টিটিউট অফ এনভায়রনমেন্ট অ্যান্ড ডেভেলপমেন্ট, অ্যান্ড্রু নর্টন পরিচালক একই ইনস্টিটিউটের। তারা যেভাবে বললেন বাংলাদেশ সহ ডেভেলপিং কান্ট্রি অনেক কিছু রিলেট করে যে বলে যে অ্যাওয়ারনেসটা কোন লেভেলে নেওয়া উচিত, আমরা কোথায় আছি, যে আমাদের যে ঝুঁকিও আছে বাংলাদেশের, এবং এই যে ফাইন্যান্স অ্যারেঞ্জ করা বা ইন্টারনাল সোর্স থেকে অ্যারেঞ্জ করা, তারপর রিয়েল সাস্টেনেবল সোসাইটি গড়ে তোলা, কমিউনিটি অ্যাডাপ্টেশন, সব কিছু বিষয়ে যে বিষয়গুলো তারা বললেন, আমার মনে হয় যে আমাদের পলিটিক্যাল লিডার্স যারা আছেন, যারা পলিসি মেকার্স আছেন, তাদের এই বিষয়টাকে খুবই গুরুত্ব সহকারে ভাবতে হবে। আপনাদের অনেক অনেক ধন্যবাদ।